4,000 years. That is the vast, echoing and unforgiving expanse of time separating a single, quiet decision made inside a dust-covered goat-hair tent in the blistering desert from the terrifying geopolitics that dominate the headlines of our modern world. When you watch the night skies over the Middle East today, when you see the blinding streaks of ballistic missiles crossing the heavens between Israel and Iran, trailing fire across the same atmosphere that ancient prophets once searched for answers, few realize they are witnessing the latest, most devastating chapter of a rivalry that began with one man, and with two women who could never manage to share the same roof. To understand how humanity arrived at this explosive, seemingly unsolvable moment, you cannot start your timeline in a diplomatic office in Washington, London, or Tehran. You cannot start at the borders drawn by fading European empires in the 20th century. You must go back to the very beginning. Because this conflict was not born in a sophisticated war room, nor was it birthed in the trenches of a battlefield. It was born within the intimate, fragile confines of a family. And that is exactly why 4 millennia of high-level negotiations, complex treaties, and devastating wars have never been able to solve it. If you have never heard the full, unvarnished story of what actually happened in these ancient days, stay with us. Like this video so more people can discover the sweeping stories that shaped human history. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter of our past. And now, let the story begin. The narrative opens in Ur of the Chaldeans, a thriving, wildly prosperous metropolis located in the region that is today the south of modern Iraq. In the ancient world, this was the absolute pinnacle of human civilization. It was a city defined by towering, stepped ziggurats made of baked mud brick, bustling, chaotic markets smelling of exotic spices, and an advanced, structured society. The skyline was dominated by the great ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, a monument dedicated to Sin, the powerful moon god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. In an era where the mighty scribes of Babylon recorded the movements of the stars, and ancient trading ships carried bronze and timber along the Levantine coast, long before the last messengers of Ugarit would watch their own great northern civilization eventually collapse into the ashes of the late Bronze Age collapse, the world was ruled by predictable, transaction-based gods. You offered a sacrifice, and the deity provided rain, fertility, or victory in battle. It was a transactional universe. Here, within this wealthy pagan center, lived a man named Abram. His name had not yet been changed by the divine intervention that would define his legacy. He had a wife named Sarai, a stable, highly elevated social position, substantial wealth, and absolutely no rational, logical reason to abandon the comforts of the known world to walk into the barren wilderness. But then, the voice came. The ancient texts of Genesis record the divine call directly, almost abruptly, without any theological preamble. The voice of the Creator, not a local deity confined to a mountain or a river, but the sovereign Lord of the cosmos, commanded Abram to leave his land, his relatives, and the security of his father's house, and to journey toward a land that would be shown to him. There was no map provided. There were no geographic coordinates. There was no strategic itinerary. There was only a solitary promise hanging in the desert air. And what a staggering promise it was. The Creator declared that he would make of Abram a great nation, that he would unconditionally bless those who blessed him and fiercely curse those who cursed him, and that through his specific lineage, all the families of the earth would ultimately be blessed. It was the ultimate, overarching covenant. Numerous descendants, guaranteed divine protection, and universal historical relevance. But there was one devastating, silent problem standing in the way of this grand promise. Sarai was barren. The ancient biblical text emphasizes this clinical, heartbreaking detail before the journey even begins, stating plainly and without emotion that Sarai had no children. In the ancient Near East, a woman's social worth, her security, and her legacy were entirely tethered to her ability to produce an heir. The sweeping promise of a great, world-altering nation had been placed upon the shoulders of a man whose wife was physically unable to conceive. Abram was 75 years old when he finally gathered his household. He took Sarai, his orphaned nephew Lot, all the immense wealth they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired, and stepped out into the blinding dust, marching westward toward Canaan. He crossed the unforgiving, sun-scorched terrain until he reached the towering oak of Moreh, near Shechem. There the divine voice spoke once again, refining and narrowing the covenant. Unto his descendants this specific piece of land would be given. Abram built a crude stone altar. It was the first of many, each one marking a profound encounter with a God who promised the utterly impossible to a man aging rapidly without an heir. The years began to slip away like sand violently blowing across the dunes. 5 years passed in the arid landscape, then 10 years. Abram and Sarai remained completely, tragically childless. The divine promise hung suspended in the desert air, beautiful in its poetry, but seemingly unattainable in its reality. Then came a night that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history. God led Abram outside his suffocating tent and commanded him to look up at the sprawling, infinite, diamond-dusted canopy of the night sky. "Count the stars," the voice challenged him. "If you are even capable of doing so, so shall your descendants be." The text records that Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as absolute righteousness. He held on to the faith in the dark. But when the sun rose, the reality of the daylight remained unchanged. Sarai was still barren. Imagine the crushing, daily psychological weight of living under that specific tension. You hold a direct, undeniable divine promise of countless descendants. You have abandoned your entire world, your security, and your heritage to follow this calling into a hostile land. Yet every single passing month, the inescapable biological reality of your wife confirms that there is no pregnancy, no child, no future. The chasm between the divine promise and the harsh, unyielding human reality widens with every sunrise. Abram was now 85 years old. Sarai was 75. Human biology was screaming at them that their time had permanently run out. It was within this crucible of silent, agonizing desperation that Sarai made a decision that reverberates through the millennia, echoing in the geopolitics of today. She approached her husband with a cold, pragmatic proposal. She openly acknowledged that the Lord had kept her from having children. She did not curse God, nor did she formally abandon the promise. Instead, she offered a human solution, one that was entirely acceptable, legal, and common within the cultural norms of the ancient Near East. Sarai had a young Egyptian servant named Hagar. She suggested that Abram take Hagar as a concubine, hoping that through the physical body of her servant, Sarai could legally build a family. This was not a scandalous or unprecedented idea at the time. Centuries earlier, the famous Code of Hammurabi had already strictly regulated such societal arrangements. A barren wife of high status could legally offer her female servant to her husband, and the resulting child would be legally recognized as the wife's own legitimate heir. The text says simply that Abram listened to the voice of his wife. There is no recorded hesitation. There is no desperate consultation with the divine. There is no pause to ask if this shortcut was the intended path of the Creator. After 10 grueling years of waiting in Canaan, Abram accepted a human, fleshly mechanism to force the fulfillment of a divine promise. Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, and gave her to Abram. It is a fleeting, deeply transactional moment recorded in a single sentence, but it is the exact moment that would eventually split the world in two. Hagar conceived almost immediately, and the very moment the Egyptian servant realized she carried the precious heir of the wealthy patriarch in her womb, the first violent fractures of a permanent conflict appeared. The ancient text is brutally, uncomfortably honest about the sudden toxicity that flooded the desert camp. The pregnant servant began to look upon her barren, aging mistress with open contempt. Sarai, who had carefully orchestrated this entire painful arrangement to secure her own future, could not bear the searing indignity of being mocked by her own property. She confronted Abram, her words sharp with profound resentment, blaming him entirely for the injury she now suffered. "Let the Lord judge between us," she demanded, her voice echoing in the dry heat. Abram, caught hopelessly in the terrifying storm of his own household's collapse, completely washed his hands of the dispute. "Hagar is your servant," he reasoned passively. "She is in your hands to do with as you please." What Sarai did was afflict Hagar. The ancient Hebrew text uses a heavy, violent and highly specific word, anah. It is the exact same terrifying word used generations later to describe the brutal, back-breaking oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptian pharaohs. Generations before the Great Exodus, Sarai treated her pregnant Egyptian servant with such relentless, targeted harshness that Hagar broke. She fled into the unforgiving, deadly wilderness of Shur. An Egyptian woman, completely alone, pregnant, walking into the deadly, waterless expanse of the desert, trying to find her way back to her homeland. It was a guaranteed death sentence. But Hagar was not alone in the wasteland. By a solitary spring of water in the wilderness, on the desolate road to Shur, the angel of the Lord found her. It was an unprecedented, earth-shattering moment in biblical history. Think about the profound theological weight of this encounter. Hagar, a fleeing foreign slave, a woman of no social standing, became the very first person in the entire scriptural record to receive a personal, direct visitation from the angel of the Lord. The celestial messenger asked her a dual question of origin and destination. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Hagar answered with devastating, raw honesty. She was fleeing from the presence of her mistress. The angel issued a difficult, almost impossible command, to return to the camp and submit to Sarai's heavy hand. But it was immediately followed by a staggering, monumental promise. The angel declared that her descendants would be multiplied so greatly they could not even be counted. The child growing in her womb was a boy, and he was to be named Ishmael, which translates to God hears, because the Lord had intimately heard her deep affliction in the desert. Look closely at the architecture of this divine moment. The promise given to the Egyptian servant perfectly mirrored the magnificent promise given earlier to the Hebrew patriarch. Uncountable descendants, a grand, explosive multiplication. God was forging two massive, distinct nations from the exact same household. But the angel added a chilling, highly specific prophetic description of the unborn boy that echoes across the centuries like a war drum. Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him, and he would live in perpetual hostility toward all his brothers. The unalterable destiny of permanent, grinding tension was spoken over his life before he ever drew his first breath. Hagar returned to the camp. She submitted to the harsh reality of her enslavement. She gave birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. For 13 long, formative years, Ishmael was the only son, the undisputed center of the patriarch's world. He grew up running through the dust of his father's camp, learning the rugged ways of the desert, naturally assuming the heavy mantle of the firstborn heir. He was the son Abram loved. Then, when Abram was 99 years old, the divine voice shattered the established status quo once again. The Lord appeared, establishing a formal, unbreakable covenant. Abram's name was changed to Abraham, meaning the father of many nations. Sarai's name was changed to Sarah, meaning princess. And God announced the impossible news that would transform everything. Sarah, at 90 years old, would bear a son. His name would be Isaac, and the eternal, specific covenant of God would run exclusively through him. Abraham fell on his face and laughed in sheer, overwhelming disbelief. He begged God, pleading with the desperation of a father trying to protect the reality he already knew. If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. It was the cry of a man trying to protect his firstborn. God graciously assured Abraham that Ishmael would indeed be immensely blessed, that he would father 12 princes and become a great, formidable nation. But the exclusive, eternal covenant, the promise of the land and the lineage of the Messiah, belonged solely to Isaac. Against all biological laws, the impossible child arrived. Isaac, whose name literally means laughter, was born to a centenarian father and a 90-year-old mother. Sarah proudly declared that God had brought her laughter, a laughter of joyous, victorious triumph, permanently replacing the bitter laughter of cynical disbelief. But as Isaac grew and was officially weaned, Abraham threw a massive, lavish feast to celebrate his true heir. During the height of this joyful celebration, Sarah looked across the camp and saw Ishmael, now a rugged teenager of about 17 years old, laughing. The ancient Hebrew word used here is deeply ambiguous. It can imply innocent playing, or it can carry dark, dangerous connotations of mocking, scoffing, or even threatening. Whatever Ishmael was doing in that moment, it ignited Sarah's absolute protective fury. She marched to Abraham and demanded that he cast out the slave woman and her son, fiercely refusing to let the son of an Egyptian servant share the divine inheritance with her miraculous child, Isaac. It was a demand of profound, breathtaking cruelty. Abraham was devastated, his heart torn violently between two sons. But God intervened in the darkness of the night, instructing Abraham to listen to Sarah's harsh demand, confirming definitively that the covenant line would trace exclusively through Isaac, while promising once again to make a mighty nation of Ishmael because he was Abraham's seed. Early the next morning, before the camp had fully awakened, Abraham rose in the cold darkness. He placed meager rations, some bread and a single leather skin of water, on Hagar's shoulders. He handed her the boy, and he sent them out into the terrifying void of the desert. There are no recorded words of farewell. There are no embraces, just the heavy, suffocating silence of a permanent, heartbreaking exile. When the water inevitably ran dry in the scorching desert of Beersheba, Hagar placed her exhausted teenage son under the shade of a withered desert shrub and walked away, a bowshot's distance, unable to watch the boy she loved die of thirst. She lifted her voice and wept bitterly into the empty sky. But God heard the crying boy. The angel of God called from heaven, opened Hagar's eyes to a hidden well of water, and reaffirmed the great promise of survival and multiplication. Ishmael survived the crucible. He grew into a fierce, independent man in the desert of Paran, becoming a master archer. His mother procured an Egyptian wife for him, and he fathered 12 powerful princes. From the harsh wilderness, permanently rejected by the wealthy household of the promise, the Ishmaelites were born. They became resilient nomads, fierce warriors, and wealthy traders, eventually blending deeply with the various tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. Thousands of years later, the great Islamic tradition would trace the sacred lineage of the Prophet Muhammad and the Arab people directly back to this exiled, desert-dwelling son. Isaac, meanwhile, remained in the land. He fathered Jacob, a man who would literally wrestle with a celestial being in the dark and be renamed Israel. Jacob's descendants became the 12 distinct tribes of Israel, enduring brutal slavery in Egypt, a miraculous exodus, the bloody conquest of Canaan, the glory of the monarchy, the devastation of the exile, and the eventual return. Two radically distinct peoples, two epic, sweeping historical trajectories, both branching outward from the exact same ancient tent. But where, in this complex ancestral family tree, does the modern nation of Iran appear? The Persians, who are the direct ancestors of modern Iranians, are not biologically or historically descended from Ishmael. They are an ancient Indo-European people, entirely distinct in language and ethnicity from the Semitic tribes of Abraham. In fact, in the ancient world, the Persians and the Jews were close, strategic allies. It was the legendary Persian king Cyrus the Great who famously conquered the impregnable city of Babylon in 539 BC, and officially permitted the exiled, weeping Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their destroyed temple. The biblical prophet Isaiah goes so far as to call King Cyrus the anointed of the Lord, an unprecedented, extraordinary honor bestowed upon a pagan, foreign king. For centuries, the relationship between Persia and the Jewish people was largely defined by tolerance and cooperation. The tragic, violent metamorphosis of this relationship into the existential hatred we see today did not occur through ancient bloodlines, but through a massive shift in theology and ideology. In the 7th century, the unstoppable Arab-Muslim conquests swept over the powerful Sassanid Persian Empire. Persia, a proud civilization that had practiced the ancient faith of Zoroastrianism for over a millennium, was conquered and slowly, methodically, became Islamic. In adopting this completely new faith, the Persians also adopted the deeply embedded theological narrative of the conquerors, a narrative that elevated Ishmael, the Arab lineage, and the Islamic worldview as the final privileged actors in sacred history. This profound ideological and spiritual shift simmered beneath the surface for centuries, eventually reaching a boiling point during the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which violently and permanently reshaped modern Iran. The nation was transformed overnight into a strict theocratic republic that embedded fierce, uncompromising opposition to the State of Israel into the very foundation of its constitutional existence. It was no longer a dispute over borders, nor was it an ethnic rivalry. It had become a deeply religious, apocalyptic mandate. Iran aggressively positioned itself as the vanguard, the supreme leader of the Islamic world, united in its unwavering opposition to the Jewish state. Consider the haunting, terrifying irony of this modern geopolitical configuration. A massive, powerful nation that does not actually share the biological bloodline of Abraham has become the fiercest, most dangerous antagonist of the people who do, having wholly and completely inherited the ancient spiritual wound of the Arab peoples. It is the ancient narrative of Ishmael versus Isaac, the rejected son of the Egyptian servant standing against the chosen son of the divine promise, resurrected from the dust of antiquity and armed with modern, hypersonic artillery. The secular geopolitical analysts on your television screens will endlessly discuss the price of oil, the dangerous race for nuclear enrichment, the complex proxy wars fought in Lebanon and Yemen, and the pursuit of regional hegemony. But beneath the cold, tactical calculations of modern warfare lies a deep, immovable substrate of collective memory. When supreme leaders stand at podiums and speak of existential threats and absolute annihilation, they are drawing dark water from a well of narrative exclusion that entirely transcends modern political science. The ancient stories a people tell themselves about their origins and their divine rights possess a terrifying, world-altering power. The missiles flying across the night sky today are simply the modern, mechanized manifestation of the arrows Ishmael once learned to shoot in the lonely desert of Paran. The ancient biblical record mentions only one final, profoundly quiet encounter between the two estranged brothers. When the great patriarch Abraham finally died at the age of 175, the text quietly notes that Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury him in the dark coolness of the cave of Machpelah. The exiled, desert-dwelling son and the favored, wealthy heir stood silently, side by side, looking down at the lifeless body of the deeply flawed father they had both loved, and who had fundamentally shaped both of their destinies. There is no mention of a tearful reconciliation. There are no recorded words of long overdue forgiveness. There is just the heavy, suffocating weight of two men doing their final duty, followed by a deafening, unbroken historical silence that has lasted for 4,000 years. The absolute heart-wrenching tragedy of this epic story is that the fracture was not forged by cartoonish villains. Sarah was not an inherently evil woman. She was a desperate, aging wife crushed by the immense pressure of an impossible, delayed promise. Hagar was not malicious or wicked. She was an enslaved, powerless woman grasping desperately at a sudden, unexpected elevation in her social status. Abraham was not a cruel tyrant. He was a severely flawed, aging man caught impossibly between the direct commands of the divine and the pragmatic, messy realities of human survival. They were all merely human. They reacted with impatience, with deep-seated fear, with bitter jealousy, and with wounded pride. They attempted, as we all do, to force the fulfillment of a divine promise using entirely human, broken mechanisms. And the resulting fracture was catastrophic, splitting the very foundation of human civilization. The world still bleeds today, the sirens still wail in the night, and the ground still shakes with explosions, all because of a single, impatient decision made in the quiet shadows of a desert tent 4,000 years ago. It is the ultimate proof that small, entirely understandable human choices can compound into a civilizational divide that absolutely no human treaty has ever been able to heal. If this powerful, sweeping story opens something deep within you, share it right now with someone who desperately needs to encounter these ancient foundational truths today. Every single like and share carries this vital history further into a world that has forgotten its origins. Subscribe to the channel so you are standing with us when we tell the next incredible chapter of history. The ancient stories are far from over, and neither is God's profound work in the midst of them. Until next time.